Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for watching. Today's video is the next part of my makeup crash course series where I pick a category of makeup products and I delve into the different types, who they're good for, all the ins and outs, etc, etc. And today's topic is face powders. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a list of general points about powders, and then I'm going to delve into 3 different categories of face powders. As usual with any category system, the line between each category can be very fine. So just take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. And I will let you know along the way, like which powders I use for what, even though that might not be the rule. So if you want to learn all about powders, then please keep on watching. So the first thing is, what do powders do in general? Powders tend to absorb excess moisture or oil on the skin, which is why a lot of people with more oily skin like powders, and people with drier skin or more mature skin tend to avoid powders altogether. I think that's fine as a rule if you want to keep things simple, but I also think that there is like a powder for everyone and for every skin type, and using a powder can really take your makeup to the next level. The next point is that a powder can be loose or pressed. This is what a loose powder looks like, where it has usually a sifter and the product comes out of there and you can dispense it into the cap. And then a pressed powder looks like this, where it's just pressed into the pan. Obviously I really like this powder because I have hit pan on it. I like loose powders better because I have the option to bake with them. Like, you know, when people pack a lot of powder on and then sweep it away after they let it cook on their skin, which is not something I do every day, but I have the option to do that with a loose powder. And also I'm a makeup artist, so having loose powders in my kit is good because I can just work out of the cap, sanitize the cap, and I haven't contaminated the whole powder. Pressed powders are a little bit better to throw in your purse, a little bit more travel friendly. So that's kind of the only thing to keep in mind between loose and pressed powders. The next general point is that a powder can either be colorless or translucent, or have some color and some coverage to it. The good thing about translucent powders is that obviously they have no color, so they're going to work for a bunch of different skin tones. The only problem is that translucent powders can appear ashy on deeper skin tones. That's not to say that every translucent powder will do that, but a lot of them will. And when I go through my 3 categories in a sec, I'm going to give examples and say like which skin tones they work for. The final point I want to make before I delve into the 3 categories is that powder is an essential part of my makeup routine. I also don't like to use primers on a daily basis because generally I'm like not okay with the ingredients in primers. So I like to use powder to lock everything in place. So now I'm going to talk about my 3 categories of powders, and they are foundation powders, setting powders, and finishing powders. So now for the first category, foundation powders. Foundation powders are meant to offer coverage all over the face just the way a liquid or cream foundation would. They are intended to be worn alone as your foundation. As usual, some are pressed, some are loose, and they vary in coverage, just as any foundation would. So an example of 2 pretty full coverage powder foundations are the MAC Studio Fix and the Tarte Amazonian Clay. Studio Fix is a little bit more mattifying, Amazonian Clay is a little bit more balancing and illuminating. You can choose a mattifying or illuminating powder based on your skin type, like if you want to go with a finish opposite to your natural one and balance your skin type, or if both work for you, then you can just choose whatever your preference is. 2 examples of powder foundations with a little bit of a lighter coverage are the Kat Von D Lock It Tattoo Powder Foundation and the Body Shop Extra Virgin Minerals Loose Powder Foundation. Again, this one's pressed, this one's loose. I really love both. I think this one has a little bit better coverage than this one, but mineral makeup tends to look a lot more natural on the skin. If you wanted mineral makeup with decent coverage, I would try Bare Minerals instead of this one, but I love the finish that this one gives. Love this powder so much. The other cool thing about mineral foundations is that they don't get caught in your beard. So if you have a beard, mineral foundation might be the way to go. Another fun fact about these 2 powders is that they both have kaolin in them. Basically, kaolin is a clay that makes a powder really long wearing, so that's awesome. Generally, I recommend applying a powder foundation with a brush. I know most pressed powder foundations come with like a little sponge with them. The sponge will give you more coverage, but I mean, these sponges aren't really sanitary. And the nice thing about a brush is that you can really buff it in, which is going to create like more of a seamless finish. So these brushes that I have right here are all good for powder foundation. These 2 are like really fluffy. This one's the e.l.f. complexion brush. This is the Mica Bella foundation brush. Both of these have like a really wide head. See, they're about the size of my cheek, and they're very fluffy. So these are gonna give you like a lighter application of foundation. Whereas this Real Techniques multitasker brush is somewhere in the middle because it's a little bit denser, but still has like a pretty fluffy end to it. And then the head on this one is really like, well, not super dense, but denser. So this is the Real Techniques buffing brush. You can use this with liquid or powder because it's synthetic. But yeah, a brush that's a little more densely packed like this is gonna give you more coverage. The same way a sponge would, but you can actually use a brush to buff the foundation in, which is awesome. As long as the brushes are soft enough that they kind of mimic natural hair, that's kind of what you wanna go for. Don't go for anything that's like plasticky because those are better at picking up creams. The fluffier brushes for powders are where it's at. So category number 2 is setting powders. And setting powders, like foundation powders, can be pressed or loose. They're more commonly loose. They can also have color or be translucent. The point of a setting powder is to set your liquid or cream foundation and concealer. So setting means that it's gonna lock it in place by absorbing excess moisture. That's kind of just a general rule with makeup. If you have a cream product or a liquid product, and you set a powder product on top of it, it's gonna lock it in, create a more long-lasting finish with more coverage. However, if your powder is translucent, it will not add more coverage. You do need to be careful though, because powder on the skin could lead to texture on the skin no matter what kind of powder it is. As I mentioned before, if your skin is very dry or if your skin is mature and you feel like powder settles into your fine lines, there really isn't a need to set your foundation with powder. Setting powders, while not as dense as foundation powders, might still be a little too dense for very dry skin or mature skin. I generally use a fluffy brush to pat the setting powder over the foundation, and then once I've patted over the entire face or the areas that I want to set, I whisk or sweep away any excess powder. The best way to do it though is to use a powder puff first. So pat the powder all over to set and then take your fluffy brush and whisk away any excess powder. Basically, I use a brush just because like I don't want to be replacing my dirty puffs all the time, but it's better to use a puff because a puff really allows you to press and roll and get the powder in there without disrupting your foundation. Whereas anything with bristles, I mean, unless the brush is very soft, those bristles will lift a little bit of your foundation, especially if you're not careful with the patting. That being said, no matter what technique you use, make sure you pat to set before you buff or sweep because your foundation is wet, and if you buff over a wet surface, it's just gonna wipe away the first thing you put down. So some examples of different types of setting powders are the Laura Mercier Loose Translucent Setting Powder. This one is actually really good for all skin tones. I've used it on people with deeper skin tones and it doesn't appear ashy on them or give a bad flashback. Another loose setting powder that's really good for people with medium to deep skin tones is the Nye Banana Powder. If you're fair like me, there's really no reason to use a yellow powder. Yellow powders are for brightening, like under the eyes or in the T-zone, for people with medium to dark skin tones. Now, there's really only one affordable loose translucent powder that I like, and that is the Coty Airspun Loose Face Powder. Now, I have the shade Translucent Extra Coverage, which to me doesn't make a ton of sense, but I suppose if you were to use this prior to your foundation, it would give you a ton of coverage. I generally recommend putting powder on after your foundation. As far as putting powder on before your foundation, it can be done. It's not my favorite technique, but I think Wayne Goss has a video on it. If I can find it, I will link it down below for you guys. But anyway, this powder works for all skin tones in terms of depth, but it definitely turns my face a little bit pink. So I save this for my kit for clients with more of like a peachy undertone. But they do have another shade available that I really want to get my hands on, but the other shade is supposed to work a lot better for people with like more neutral yellow undertones. But this is a great affordable setting powder. This is my favorite setting powder at the moment. This is the NARS Soft Velvet Loose Powder, and I have mine in the shade Snow. This is about a shade or two lighter than my natural skin tone, so I use this to set under my eyes and in my T-zone to brighten a little bit. And I think on the website they describe this as a soft matte finish, and I would say that's correct. A little bit of shine does peek through with this for me throughout the day, but it does hold the makeup in place really well. These two powders are actually my favorite powders to cook my makeup with. Again, that's the technique where you pack on a bunch of powder and let it cook on your skin and then whisk it away after a few minutes. Which again, I don't do every day, but when I do, these are my go-to powders for that. And to set the rest of my face, like where it should be my actual color, I honestly don't have an actual setting powder that I like for that on my skin. I actually use foundation powders. Now, I don't use full coverage foundation to set my full coverage foundation. I mean, back when I had some really bad acne scarring, I would definitely do that, like for special occasions or for photography. Like I would use a full coverage liquid foundation and then I would set it with MAC Studio Fix, which is a ton of coverage. I mean, I believe you should do what floats your boat, but do I recommend it for everybody? No. If you're gonna use a powder with a little bit of coverage in it to set your foundation, your liquid foundation that's already got coverage in it, I recommend the two lighter coverage powders that I mentioned before. They are the Kat Von D Lock It Tattoo Foundation Powder and the Body Shop Extra Virgin Mineral Powder. Now moving on to category number 3, which is finishing powders. Finishing powders may appear to be setting powders, but they're not. And you have to be careful because some finishing powders appear to be any old translucent powder. For example, the NARS Crystal Powder. This is marketed as a setting powder, but I would argue that it's not. And then the Tarte Smooth Operator finishing powder, and then the Makeup Forever HD finishing powder. These powders are all examples of HD powders or silica powders or micro powders, whatever you want to call them. What they all have in common is that they're super finely milled and they all have silica in them. Sometimes, I don't know if you can tell right here, but when I open this, a cloud comes out. I don't know if you could see that on camera, but that's how finely milled they are, that the slightest motion, like the slightest movement of air, will kick up a cloud of powder. And because they're so finely milled, they look absolutely gorgeous on the skin. Like they absolutely blur texture and pores without looking like makeup. It's amazing. This is not the same one that I just showed you, by the way. It's the same packaging, but I'm talking about their translucent powder now. The reason I wouldn't use an HD finishing powder to set your makeup, generally speaking, is because number one, it's so fine that it's not dense enough to lock your makeup in place. If your skin is oily combination, maybe normal. The reason the Laura Mercier translucent powder will work as a setting powder is because it's a little bit denser. Now the other thing is, no matter what your skin tone is, these will give flashback if not used correctly. Because look just how white these are. They look almost blue. That's because it's so finely milled and because it has the silica in it. I used to have the NYX HD finishing powder from the drugstore, and no matter how well I buffed it in, it gave a flashback. These, if used properly, will not give a flashback. And by used properly, I mean use one really thin layer and be sure to whisk away the excess or buff them properly into the skin. Another reason I like HD finishing powders is because they look amazing on HD camera. I prefer the NARS one for a couple of reasons that I won't get into. Now, those are mattifying, pore blurring, skin enhancing for HD video finishing powders. Another type of finishing powder I want to share with you guys is more of an illuminating finishing powder. So something like the Hourglass Ambient Lighting Powders is a great example of this. So these have a really fine, really fine shimmer to them. Now the way I use these is once my makeup is already set, like with my setting powders, I use these to buff into the skin over everything. Actually, when everything is done, like contour, blush, whatever, I use these last to give my skin a more radiant finish when I'm in that kind of mood. It's not often, but that's how I use these. Sometimes I'll use the lightest one as like a subtle highlight, but otherwise I pretty much use these as finishing powders, which is what they're intended to be. And again, I use some sort of fluffy, soft type brush to buff these all over the skin. And while a setting powder can have a nice finish on its own, a finishing powder is going to give you more of a filtered look, if that makes sense. If your skin is super dry or if you have mature skin, these would actually make really nice setting powders. Today I actually did use a finishing powder. I used the NARS Translucent Crystal. I use this to set my face only because I'm wearing a foundation that I know does not budge, which is very rare for me. But yeah, that's an example where you could just use a finishing powder after your foundation. Another example is if you're very dry or you have mature skin. Like my mom has mature but oily skin, so I use this to set her makeup. So kind of just based on your preference of finish and your skin type, it's about kind of like figuring out which powder is best for you. Obviously, since I have like normal combination skin and I love my options and have a makeup kit for clients, I have all of these powders. But when you're shopping, as always, I would say it's good to know what your skin type is, how much coverage you want. If you want really long-lasting, high coverage, get a liquid foundation and a setting powder. And then if you find that you're having some textural issues, you might want to invest in a finishing powder as well, especially if it's for video or special occasion or what have you. Okay guys, so that's it for my powders crash course. Let me know what you guys thought of this video. Let me know what you guys think of this series. Do you like the way I kind of break everything down? Do you find it overwhelming? Is it helpful for when you're shopping? Let me know what you think. If you like this series, please give this video a thumbs up and please let me know what makeup category you want to learn all about next in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. I upload every Monday and Thursday, and that's about it. Have a good day, you guys. Or if you're not having a great day, that's totally fine too. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.